Excellent. We can start now. Welcome, colleagues and friends, to this session about building trust in data and statistics. You know, we live in very interesting times because data rules every bit of our lives, from how we travel, how we buy and sell, how we fight crime, and even how we fight pandemics like COVID-19 as we have in these past 2 years. This session will showcase experiences from Kenya, from South Africa, and Mauritius, as well as explore the role that Africa-wide entities such as the AU could play in supporting data innovation and data protection across the continent. Our discussions will also reveal that each of these perspectives has interest for both data use, data protection, and hopefully we will discuss some practical approaches to strike some balance between them. Perhaps if we have time, we shall also touch on the issues of this week, including the outage of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and what impact, if any, they might have on building trust on how data is handled. Now, we have with us an amazing set of panelists, including veteran statistician Zachary Mwangi, the former special AU rapporteur on freedom of expression, Pansy Tlakula. We are honored to have with us the Data Protection Commissioner of Mauritius, Rudisha Madhu, and the Executive Director of Amnesty International, our friend Irongo Houghton, who we are we commiserate with because he has to be here at 3 a.m. where he is right now. So thank you to all of you for having joined us. And because of the fact that we only have an hour for this session, I'm going to hand over to my friend, Sarah Lucas, to start us off with the first session, which is a conversation between her and Zachary Mwangi. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. We can't let you get by without introducing yourself. Of course, Al Kaggs, none other than, who is the founder and director of Open Institute in Kenya. So now I'm going to turn it over to a conversation with Zachary Mwangi. Zachary is known to many, if not all of you, as the former chief statistician for Kenya, the head of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and he also served as chairperson for the UN Statistics Commission. So no one better than you, Zachary, to kick off our conversation today. It is an honor to be in conversation with you. We're going to just take a few minutes to set the stage for this evening's conversation about data governance. So I just would love to invite you to really openly reflect with us on the past 10 years of your professional career. Now that the KNBS and the UNSC is behind you, we're hoping to really get your reflections. And so let me start with just a big picture question, which is, as you look back on the last 10 years of the data agenda, the data for development space, and even data governance as an issue, how have you seen these evolve over the past decade? It has been quite a decade for these issues. So how have you seen them evolve over the past 5 to 10 years?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me into this panel and also to join my distinguished panelists. I think it's very interesting that in the last 10 years, a lot of development has taken place in this conversation on data for development, and now data rights, and the whole issue of data governance. And we acknowledge that the global agenda, like the Sustainable Development Goals at the continental level, the African Union Agenda 2063, integrating statistics into the national planning processes, have actually put a lot of pressure on the national statistical system in the continent so that we can track these goals, these priorities, we measure and ensure that we leave no one behind. And we acknowledge that we require quality, timely, and disaggregated data. Without that, we cannot plan, we don't know where we'll be going. So this conversation also on data has also been driven by the realization that no one institution can produce the data that is necessary to achieve these global, regional, and national goals, priorities, and plan. In the past, the NSO, that is the National Statistical Offices, were generally the only producers of statistics, and this is no longer the case now as we move. We have various types of producers, users of data. So the whole of the data ecosystem is being engaged now, and as can be demonstrated by even this forum that we're having today. So what we need and there is the issue of the strong partnerships, collaborations, so that we move this process forward. But reflecting on our continent, we'll see that there are some countries in our region which are stuck in the vicious circle of low interest in demand for quality data for decision making. Again, the low interest and demand result in weak statistical institutions, and these weak statistical institutions bring about the issue of poor governance structures, inadequate staffing levels, particularly of national statistical offices, poor infrastructure and tools. We also do have issues to do with the low human capacity, and this is both at the data production level and users level. So the other element because of this is the coordination. We don't, or we lack in some cases, coordination and collaboration mechanism within the data ecosystem. And these challenges in turn result into low quality data, which reinforces the initial position of the low or lack of interest and demand, particularly at the policy level. But what we can note is that a lot of efforts have been done, but more still needs to be done. We know at the UN level, the United Nations Statistical Commission is doing a great job in promoting the development of national statistics and improving their comparability. At our continent, a lot of initiatives have been undertaken, both at the regional and the sub-regional level. We have the Pan-African institutions, African Development Bank, the Economic Commission for Africa, the AU, doing fantastic work in this space of data. We now talk about a strategy for the harmonization of statistics in Africa. Even at the sub-regional level, we have regional economic communities, like in our case, we have the East African community, again, all aimed at trying to support the development of statistics in the region. And these initiatives, also the engagement of the civil society, the development partners, that's the donor community, and a little bit on the private sector engagement. So what we see is that this is a conversation that is continuing, and we need to engage stakeholders, both state and non-state actors, because initially the focus was purely or more majorly on the state actors. During my tenure, I initiated a lot of conversation and dialogue with the non-state actors, and we try to include them in our statistical programming. And we used to have sector working groups, so we could do the engagement. And now data, I could say, is that it's not only for the NSOs, but for the wider data ecosystem. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that you're so right that over the past 10 years, the shift in focus to a much wider ecosystem of actors working on data is spot on. And I think you've been a champion of that. We've talked about that before. And I think that in our earlier conversations at previous World Data Fora and also at the UN Statistical Commission sessions, you know, we've talked a lot about this need for more demand and use of data and the kinds of partnerships that you've pursued. And all of these, I think we've very strongly thought about as opportunities over the past 5 or 10 years. And I think that the past year has sobered us a bit on some of the risks associated with data as well. If you look at the data use in the COVID pandemic, both in opportunities and risk, a real risk lens on how data was used in some places. And I think even if you just look at Kenya's example over the past year and a half or two, there's been an admittedly rocky road, right? I mean, there was some pretty healthy and intense public debate around the census, around the digital ID system, around the data protection legislation. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the issues emerging around data governance and data rights. And what part of that agenda, the kind of the risk mitigation agenda, do you find particularly compelling and useful? And which sides do you think are maybe less so?
Hey, thank you very much. We need to appreciate that COVID is a new experience to us. It also provided opportunities to think outside the box, because a lot of disruption were brought in by the COVID pandemic. So it more or less also expanded the debate and focusing on data for development, and also the element of what are the data rights. And we acknowledge that governments around the world did resort to tracking technology and other data-driven tools to monitor and curb the spread of the disease. And more so like locational data from the mobile phones to monitor and to determine and understand the movement of people, groups, so that we can get insight on how the virus was spreading or is spreading, and whether the instructions were being followed. You know, this is intrusive into personal data, but it is particularly very helpful because it has enabled governments or countries to curb or to slow down the spread. So what we need to acknowledge is that new technologies and expanding the use of digital and mobile communication presents an opportunity for the continent, because this is a new data source. If it was the traditional data sources doing a survey, for example, it would have been very difficult to get timely data, because one of the things is to ensure that we have timely data that can inform the decision-making processes. So that is a very positive side. However, the issues of the trust, how do we trust this data? How the data is generated? The issues of the privacy issues come into play. Who are the owners of this data? How do we access this data? Is it available to even other state agencies like the National Statistics Office? And therein comes in the whole issue of the data protection and having an effective governance, data governance structure. Again, at the continental level, there are the challenges of the digital divide, where we have some countries that are not technologically more advanced in these issues of technology. And we can note that the last count, we find that in Africa, we have like only 27 countries have enacted privacy and data protection laws that would provide the necessary data governance framework, so that we could have an enabling environment for access, the whole issue of the use and the sharing of the personal data. So for me, I see that this is a good debate. We experienced also issues when we were doing the last census. We did our last census, population and housing census in 2019, and we used technology. We did the first digital census. The results were out, the preliminary results were out within a period of 2 months. So that is a good plus, tapping into technology and the whole of the digitization process. And there was a lot of excitement, people calling that they needed to be counted. We had a time period that for the counting, and we had a hotline, and you could see the interest with the people. And that demonstrates that public awareness about the importance of data, that they want to be, not to be excluded. Then the government also did roll out a digital ID, and this was aimed at strengthening the registration process. And finally, we also had our Data Protection Act enacted. So from our side, we were looking at the issues of the governance. And one of the things is to have strong legal frameworks. These are prerequisites if you want to balance data use and data rights. So NSOs would require to have strong statistical acts that are anchored into the fundamental principles of official statistics so that they can support the mandate of the national statistical system. Again, the whole issue of the political will, it's so important that the political support should be there, because even enactment of the legislation is not a simple or an easy thing. So for me, I see that this is good space for our country. The issue is it's a process. We need to continue engaging the public so that we ensure that we have a collect or a good balance between data and also the rights of the people. Back to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've perfectly teed up the dynamics of both the policy and the politics of getting the balance right between data use and data protection and privacy. So given that we're short on time, I'm going to turn it over to Al, because I know he's going to dig deep into everything that you have just laid on the table. And I know, Zachary, and I'm excited about the fact that you're doing some work now on the data governance side. So I think that this emerging field is really going to benefit from your deep experience in this space as you move into more scholarship around data governance. So please, everybody, stay tuned for what Zachary has to say in the next months on this. And thank you for setting the stage so very well for us. Over to you, Al.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zachary and Sarah. Tell you what, if there was ever an important conversation or important insights, I think the ones that Zachary has given today are some of my favorites. The biggest thought that I have been left with, especially, is the issue of the data divide that is happening in Africa, simply because of the fact that in my own life at the Open Institute, that is something that I am constantly having to think about. I just want to turn it over and invite Dudisha Madub, who is the Data Protection Commissioner for Mauritius, to come closer. The former AU Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, Patsit Lakula, is also going to be joining us in a minute. And our friend Nirongo Houghton of Amnesty International Kenya. And I just wanted to give you all about a minute just to react to Zachary's thoughts and just, what stood out the most for you, even before we go into our own conversation. I'll start with you, Dudisha.
Thank you. I think Zachary has really laid the foundations with regard to all the confusions, around data use, data protection, privacy, and all the related issues. What really I'm very much interested in, because we all know that we need robust legislative frameworks across Africa to be able to contain the data divide. But most importantly for me is political will and political support. I think in this particular area, we are really, really not very sure about what's happening across the continent. Because if I can tell you my own personal experience in Mauritius, is that yes, we do have strong frameworks here. We have a data governance framework for around almost 8 to 9 years already. Data protection clauses very well inserted and being applied in the public sector as well as in the private sector. But the question, which is always like very weak, is how far can we really grapple with political support? And from my own personal experience, this is the most difficult question that we have to address. And there are no practical or straightforward solutions to be able to ensure that we always get the political support that, for example, a data protection institution requires to be able to fulfill its mandate in the right way. Because right now, what's happening is, I think, from a global perspective, this is very important to understand, is that we have the pandemic, which has really kick-started the digital transformation globally. And to be able to really make digital transformation meaningful, it has to be really pressurized on governments that they need to give the right support for these institutions to be able to represent the interests of the citizen when this digital transformation is happening, accompanying the citizen in the right way. And that is something, the education along with the support is really lacking. I wanted just to highlight this point. And as you know, Mauritius has done a lot in regards to data protection, and we have a second legislation already in place since 2018, and we're moving towards international norms and standards being incorporated. And there's no stone left unturned by, let's say, my office and other peers working in the area, the statistics office, to be able to ensure that we have meaningful principles on ground. But what is really important is that internationally we get this coverage, we get this, umbrella protection that we require to be able to voice out how important data protection has become today, to our governments and to all the relevant stakeholders at play. Thank you.
Indeed. And I'm going to turn to Pansy now and say, Pansy, you worked at a continental level. You now work in South Africa at national level, but you worked at continental level. What are the challenges that you have seen, and what are the opportunities that we have for purposes of getting that political support that Judisha is talking about? Because that is one of the bigger points, and data is political by its very nature.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say two things regarding South Africa in particular, and bearing in mind that the whole debate about data protection in South Africa is new, with the information regulator just being 5 years old, and the enforcement powers of the regulator having come into effect in July this year. What I have observed is that I don't think it has sunk to our government that you cannot talk about the fourth industrial revolution, talk about the digital economy without putting data protection at the center of those debates. Those debates happen outside the information regulator. That's the first thing to say. And that's where the issue of it's not really lack of political will. I think it's lack of education on the importance of data protection in the 21st century. At the AU level, we have the Malabo Convention, which up to now has not come into effect because it doesn't have 15 required ratifications for it to come into effect. It was adopted so long ago that before it even comes into effect, it is already outdated. And we're trying to catch up by now talking about, I know that the AU is trying to come up with a new regulation for data protection, which will apply continentally. The challenge that we have on the continent is that we don't have our own GDPR. So different countries have their own data protection laws. So we're not singing from the same hymn book, if I can put it that way. But also, I think what we need to do, all of us who work on data protection is to just have that paradigm shift to say data protection is a human right. We must start from the human rights perspective to say my data is my human dignity, and it is therefore my privacy. Therefore, no one has any right to do as they wish with my data. So as we talk about using data for development, we should also bear in mind that as far as personal data is concerned, no one has the right to use my data without observing and protecting my dignity and my privacy. I think if we begin to emphasize the human rights aspect of data protection and move away from what I regard as people regarding data protection as a technology issue, I think we'll do well. And those are my preliminary remarks.
Indeed, and you see, data as a human rights issue is an interesting thing, and it has an impact on how policies it plays out, doesn't it, Irungu? Because of the fact that on the one hand, in general, policy or political level people are not very excited to discuss both those issues, the question of human rights and the question of data governance, partly because of education, but also partly because of its political implications in some cases. Irungu, I'm going to call you in to just speak a little bit about this, because of the fact that you work at the very heart of human rights, of the human rights agendas.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pansy's raised a great point about what's the context of this work. And, you know, for Amnesty International, not just in Kenya, but even globally, I think there are two ends to this. One is, of course, you know, the right to privacy, the right to protect, the right to own your own data, and essentially to have to consent to that data being taken into the public domain or used in a particular way for a particular policy or not. But the second part of that really is how to use, you know, how to use data and evidence to essentially drive human rights-based policies, the right to health, the right to education, the right to water, but even the right to safe policing in a community. So I think these are the two aspects of this. I'm struck listening to the conversation so far by two things. One is how you know it is, you know, how much we need courage to be able to tell the truth these days, and it's not just that data is neutral and that it is somehow above the fray of politics and policy, but actually it is it is the center. It's at the center really of political processes and data. In the same way that Charles Gishuki, a young anti-corruption blogger, a year ago had to be protected by Amnesty International for essentially putting data on an anti-corruption tracker that demonstrated that something like about $20 million was being lost by the Kenyan government through corruption. We didn't have the same experience. We had no request from the Office of the Presidency when the president himself made the same allegation publicly about a year later. And you know, the question is, you know, who can tell the truth? Who's allowed to tell the truth? Zachary, you know, left the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, in my view, with a good legacy. He essentially made statistics interesting. There were a number of important statistical surveys that drove policy. The census he referred to was controversial. Amnesty and Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and possibly the Ministry of Development clashed on the use of personally verifiable data in a census, which historically and I think by law is not allowed. But I think the point is that it's always taken courage to be a Director General of the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And, his predecessor, Jotham Mwangi, several years ago, 20 years ago, was really vilified for essentially pointing out that a huge scandal called the Goldenberg scandal had essentially, allowed a couple of businessmen to take off with $5 million from the National Treasury and reduce the GDP by about 10% just through a series of fictitious gold holdings. So I think the first thing is to say, yes, it is profoundly political. But I think the second point, if you allow me just to go into this, is, we have to recognize that statistics are no longer sexy, right? I mean, they're just not seen by the bulk of our populations as trustworthy. In some ways, people even feel insulted by statistics. And just to give an example of this in the field that I work, which is really looking at professional policing, you have now refrains very publicly saying, say their name, say their name, say their name. And I think it's important to see that slogan in the context of the fact that actually people don't want statistical trends about how many people, young men, have been killed by police officers. What they want to know is what was the human experience of that, and whether it be the Me Too campaigns or the Say the Name campaigns around extrajudicial killings, people really want to get a sense of the human experience of that. And ultimately, for many of us, if we're given the choice between our emotions and the facts, we will choose our emotions anytime, whether it be on controversial issues of abortion or sexual and reproductive health rights, whether it be our issues of LGBTIQ rights, or whether it is just, whether I like my favorite politician or not. So I think we have to recognize that actually we are living in a context in which, statistics is not exciting to people. People want anecdotes. Just give me a good soundbite and forget about the percentage trend, right? I'll come back on COVID if I get a chance later, but I just wanted to open that up a little bit, Al.
And you see, that's a really important point that you make, because when you're talking about things like statistics not being sexy and not being very congruent to human experiences, you find that there are many situations. This week, we had a new leak that is called the Pandora Papers that came out. And Mauritius is one of the countries that's actually listed on these leaks. And Mauritius has also been doing a lot of work with regard to making sure that they are not seen as one of those terrible heavens, and that they are working very well. And I think one of the interesting things in data protection that Mauritius has done is to put the Data Protection Office very close to the Prime Minister's office. Pansy, I'd love to hear, this is the line between protection, data protection, and openness is one that you guys are constantly having to deal with. First of all, from the perspective of having favorable financial sector policies, but at the same time protecting people's rights. And you've done fairly well about this. Would you just talk a bit about that work that you've been doing, and even just how you have been able to get, as a country, data protection to come so close to the Prime Minister's office, and therefore so close to policy and politics? Rudisha?
Yeah, actually, I have to add a corrigendum to this statement. What happens is that the office initiated its operations under the auspices the Prime Minister's office, but with the new government right now, because the Prime Minister actually handled the Ministry of IT as well. So when he moved, then we stayed under the Ministry of IT. So this is the new status for the data protection of it. It doesn't change anything in terms of functioning. But I think it's very important to understand that the independence of the Data Protection Office is vital. I mean, whichever ministry you place the Data Protection Office under, what is important is the independence, the full, complete independence of the office. Why is it very important? This is very linked to the debate for political support and everything. Let me explain to you how we operate here at our level. We produce a report to the National Parliament every year. And in this report, if we are not independent, then we have an issue with governance, because this is for us very sacred. The most fundamental aspect in data protection right now is for an institution to be effective, it has to be completely independent. I must say that in practice, I've had many experiences with our political peers and the minister, the ministries as well, with regard to my very outgoing, independent attitude. And this has landed me into trouble as well. I won't hide it. But that's part of what a data protection function is about. It's part of being a human rights activist, because data protection is human rights. It's not technology. Technology is just a component of data protection, and it will never be the most important component in data protection, because we're talking about protection and privacy here. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if the independence of the office is not grounded right from the outset, right from the creation of the office, there is absolutely no point in having such an institution in your country. Because what will happen is that this institution will just be, like the term we use in Mauritius, a white elephant. So yes, definitely. And I've seen when we started, people were telling me, that, what would you be able to handle this office? Because it's highly politicized. It's highly, it's got a political impact that you cannot ignore. And you are a professional. You are someone you are a barrister. You're an independent professional. How will you be able to do that? I said, I don't know. Let me try. Let me give it a try. And I gave it a try. And it's been almost 14 years that I'm in office. But I must say that this is perhaps the most difficult position that I've handled in my whole career, because it's highly sensitive. We have to be able to convince the government. We have to be able to convince the people that we have their interests at stake. And the most beautiful outcome of how I've been able to use persuasion is when I started investigation, when I started giving what we call here quasi-judgments, when people started going an appeal to the Supreme Court, to what we call the ICT tribunals, and they saw that we actually mean business, in the sense that what we were giving as product to the nation shows that it actually is protecting them. That was the most important aspect in my job, and it still is. And I think this is where my credibility starts, and where my credibility actually grew. And so that's what I would like to say, unless, Al, you have other questions, because I become very passionate when the debate starts. So you just tell me, what would you like to hear? But I'm telling you the truth. And the truth is something that many people in my profession and in my position, actually, it becomes very difficult to say. But that's me, and I will continue to be like that, because I believe not only in Mauritius, I believe in privacy, I believe in protection. And for me, this is sacred. If you talk about human dignity, then please mean it. Just don't talk about it. Let's be fair about it. Thank you.
And that's actually very important. Pansy, I want to come to you and especially focus on your work at the Information Regulator. Now, the phrasing regulator, would suggest that instead of fighting for being an advocate for the citizens, which data protection requires, you advocate for the government, where you're thinking about us versus them. But what I wanted to ask you is that the case first? And two, how are you succeeding to speak truth to the government and to get to the government to actually take care of citizen interests?
Thank you very much. No. The regulator part is just a name. I think you have to look at our mandate, which is quite wide, because it includes educating, it includes monitoring, it includes complaints handling. And I must say that we are fortunate in the sense that we are responsible for two rights: privacy, as it relates to data protection. We call it protection of personal information in our jurisdiction, but we are also responsible for access to information. And that is important, because at all times, these rights balance each other. And if that's not the case, privacy can be used to promote opaqueness So it is always important to ensure that while protecting personal information, we have to ensure that we don't stifle free flow of information and freedom of expression. And that is why our regulator is responsible for both rights. We call ourselves a super regulator in the sense that we regulate everybody. We are also fortunate because we don't account to any executive. We are independent. We don't fall under any ministry. We are accountable directly to the National Assembly, not through a ministry. And I think that the courage that you have to have is to apply the law and apply it equally to everyone. And also ensure that you don't make threats that you don't carry out. When you say to people you have to comply, if you're not complying, I will take action. You have to do that. So because we are a new institution at this point in time, we have been very accommodating, taking everybody on board, trying to educate and have discussions with all our stakeholders about compliance and saying to them, you have had these 3 years to comply, and we are assisting you with your compliance framework. But do know that at this point now, our powers are now effective. And for us, non-compliance can lead up to an administrative fine of 10 million rands. I don't know how many dollars that is. And it can lead also to 10 years imprisonment. So I think that helps. Since the 1st of July, when our powers came into effect, people are so scared, to say that they will go to jail. And we are also putting the fear of the Lord in them to say, if you don't comply, look at the consequences for non-compliance. And that has helped. And we find that everyone now wants to make sure that they are on the correct side of the law. I hope that before this finishes, we will talk about COVID and data protection, because that's where we are, and say, how do we move forward in terms of use of data to manage the spread of the data that has been collected to that effect. Thank you, El.
Indeed, I wanted to bring in Irongo here and ask him to mention something around how he, from the perspective of Amnesty International, not just Kenya, but globally, how have you seen, the COVID-19, especially sensitive personal data, handled in various countries, and what are the gaps that you have sort of observed?
Yeah, I think we're living in a really interesting time for data protection and also the use of data for the right to health. And I think probably there are 3 things. Let me just start off so that I'm not misunderstood. Is, I really believe that universal vaccination is critical, not just for Kenya, but globally. I also have personally vaccinated. I held back 6 months because I wanted doctors and police officers to be vaccinated first. But at the moment at which vaccines arrived in Kenya at a certain volume, I vaccinated, right? Let me just put that out there. But I think there are 3 areas really that I think we have to look at carefully at the moment. And there is a creeping vaccine authoritarianism that is developing. And it shows its form in kind of 2 or 3 different ways. The first is the idea that it is no longer possible for people to elect out of vaccination. And we had a situation in Kenya about 2 months ago where all civil servants were commanded to vaccinate by a particular point. And there were very good reasons why this needed to happen. But the key thing there really is that the more we move towards a coercive approach to vaccination and less a public education approach, then we begin to infringe and stoke a resistance to something that I think everybody should be thinking about doing. The second area really is the conspiracy of silence that seems to be growing up around issues to do with side effects from the vaccine. There is a creeping disinterest, a lack of enthusiasm about capturing the side effects of people vaccinating. And I think for me, I find that troubling. That's it. And the third one, and the last one, is vaccine inequality. It took 3 months after the vaccination program started in Kenya for for the government to start breaking down data a little bit further from the other category. So there was like so many police officers vaccinated, so many health workers vaccinated, and then there was this other category. And a number of us said, hold on a minute, you have to break this down. We need to know how many elderly people, right? How many people with comorbidities are being vaccinated, because that's where the front line of this disease is impacting on our society. And it took 3 months again for us to get an elderly category into the public announcements by the Ministry of Health. And I think that's the work of human rights activists, is to just keep breaking down the data so that we actually get a sense of the most marginalized and the most affected people and how is it impacting on them. I'll leave the smartphones and QWERTY codes to somebody else, because I think that's another great conversation to have.
Sarah, I want to bring you in here, and in particular, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the power dynamic that is relating to vaccine inequality specifically. If you look at it right now, I think the US, Canada, and others are looking at having a third shot. Whereas many countries in Africa, for example, they have even 70% of their populations not even getting their first shot. And this is mainly because of even availability, not even because of desire. What is the ways that the civil society and funders and others can sort of get power to speak truth to the emerging new power dynamic that is around the COVID-19 vaccine and how the data for it is being handled?
I wish I knew, Al. I mean, to be honest with you, this is something that we watch.
I know I put you smack on the spot, but
yeah, I mean, I got to tell you from a very personal perspective, this is something we watch in the United States and feel pretty damn powerless, right? Like, I'm simultaneously outraged at the complete inequality of vaccine distribution, inequity and injustice of vaccine distribution around the world. And I also know that if I deny my 10-year-old her vaccine, it's not going to you, and so you're stuck in this really difficult position of being morally against the thing that you're doing. And so it's a hard thing to figure out. So I can't speak as a funder. I mean, there's obviously a lot of global funding going into vaccine distribution, but my sense right now is that it's not only a supply issue. It's not only a funding issue. It's an IP issue. It is a tech transfer issue. And those are the hurdles that people on the policy side need to work through. So I wish I had an answer for you. I think other than saying how we rectify the power imbalance, it's to just recognize it nakedly as that and to speak truth to that. But I wish I had a better answer for you, Al. Maybe you can give me one. Or
it was actually very good to see how the African presidents, especially, and the president of the Prime Minister of Barbados at the UN General Assembly went and spoke specifically to these issues in particular. But the real issue for us here is about how the data for vaccination, for vaccines, are actually being used to have an effect on that distribution issue. Because of the fact that you find that it's not widely, most countries are not actually publicizing their vaccine levels publicly. And so as a result, even citizens themselves are not being very aware of the challenges of distribution and so on. And it just, when citizens are not involved, then there's definitely going to be an issue of powerlessness. Zachary, I'd like to bring you in here just as we come to a close of this session. I know that we have just about 8 minutes before we close down. And Zachary, what I wanted to ask you is still about power dynamics. Because of the fact that you were a statistician, which was a very technical position. And it was one in which you must have had a lot of difficulty speaking truth to power and even to change the dynamic, because I think when you joined, for example, we needed to apply for data at the KNBS, and we needed to pay for it as well. And then you changed all of that in the course of your time, and that was not easy, I don't think. And that would, because of the fact that working with data is a political issue, the power dynamic of it is just as important for us to consider. And I'd just like to hear your voice on this particular issue.
Thank you very much. I think, as has been said, working as a DG, all in any position, even a data protection, I think you have to have that commitment, and the whole issue of leadership comes in, so that you believe in what you are doing, and you have to make bold decisions, no matter what, so long as you are acting within your defined mandate. Because there is a lot of interest, because you see, like you look at data, particularly government data, if you look at when it is tied into particularly capitation, like enrollment data, there will be a lot of bias. Population data, there will be a lot of bias because it is used to make decisions on resource allocation, for example. So as a statistician, you have to be very, very bold, because some of the publication that you release or the data you release would make the policy makers very, very uncomfortable. So what I decided when I was there was that let me make data open. I think that was one of the things that helped me. You make it open, then people can interact with that data. Then you have the issue of the timeliness, so that people are aware that during such a certain time you are going to release the data. But also at the policy, you have to also engage, because you see, you require a bit of resources. You require a lot of resources from government, because statistics data normally is a public good. So you have to ensure that you put statistics at the high political agenda. And that is normally the tricky thing about it. You have to engage your minister in charge of resources, finance, and ask, why are you doing a budget without statistics, data, current? And like from a statistical point, from a user side, it's a number. Inflation is just a number, 5%. But you don't know the dynamics that goes towards generating that data. So a lot of balance is required, but engagement, engage with the stakeholders, talk to them. And when you do like that, you succeed. But most importantly, believe in what you are doing and don't get interfered with. That somebody will tell you change a number, because that is where you lose it, and the credibility is lost and the trust is destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 4 minutes to the hour, and I know that while we have been talking, Sarah has been keenly listening to the various points. And the reason I like to put Sarah on the spot is simply because of the fact that, she has a very global perspective to a lot of things around these issues. And so I'm going to invite Sarah now to give some closing remarks to this session as we come to an end.
Thank you so much, Al, and to all of you. I was just reflecting that some of us, Al, Irungu, Judesha, gathered this time last year for World Data Forum 2020 on a very similar topic about balancing data use and data protection in Africa. And I gotta say, you guys are way fierier today than you were a year ago today. Judesha, I feel like something must have gone down in the past year in your life, because you're coming at us with a lot of conviction around independence. And you even said, if you can't ensure independence for a department, for a data protection commissioner in office, don't bother having one. That is a much stronger message than you gave us last year. And I think a really important message for Kenya, which is just setting theirs up. So the value of conversations like this is to be able to hear each other across countries. And Pansy, your conviction that how dare governments talk about the fourth industrial revolution and economic digitalization and not talk about data rights. Like, how dare they? And so these voices of kind of conviction and power, particularly coming from women, makes me happy. And I'm really, really noticing how much more fiery it is than last year. Irungo, we can always count on you to be fiery. So I'm not noticing so much difference from last year. But I will say that this really speaks to the urgency of this set of issues, the timeliness of this set of issues. So Al, Irungu, Zachary, Pansy, Judesha, you were on top of what I think is the issue in the data space. And, you know, I've been funding in the data for development space for the past 8 years. And I will say that this transition to orienting around data rights and data governance and data protection and privacy is the kind of the issue of transition and change over the past 5 or 6 years. This wasn't on the radar when we started the data for the SDGs agenda and the data revolution. Well, it wasn't on the radar for the data for development community, and it is straight on the front of that agenda now. So it's thanks to people like you that are really helping bridge the privacy and protection communities with the data use and data for development communities, because we can't move forward without wrestling these issues to the ground. So thank you for bringing fire and conviction and power and voice and smarts to this issue. It's a real honor to be with you today. And Al, thanks for being a partner in crime in this discussion.
Thank you very much to all of you for having made time. We promised that we would be ending smack at 11 o'clock, which is about 30 seconds from now. Thank you so much for having spent that hour. Thank you, Rongo, specifically, and Sarah for being up in the middle of the night to make this conversation a success. It takes a little bit extra sacrifice to be up past midnight. So thank you, everyone, and we wish you all the very best. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
Recording stopped.